A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Our special guest today is an expert on Christians understanding Islam. We'll take some time for his perspectives on trends, perhaps dominating the headlines in the Middle East right now, and some thoughts on developments with a terror attack on an Australian church overnight. Well, our guest is the author of some best-selling books like Mosques and Miracles, The Challenge of Islam and Islam Rising. We'll also be talking about his latest book, and there's a connection here too to all of these big issues that we might be facing around the world. We'll be talking about Christians and prayer. You might have heard that saying, prayer is the key which unlocks the vaults of heaven. Well, get ready. We'll have some exhilarating stories today of victories won when people pray. Our special guest is Dr. Stuart Robinson. He's an expert on Islam, having served a 60-year career in mission and church planting and church leadership in places like South Asia and here in Australia. His newest book is described as a tour de force across history, the globe, the Bible, and his personal experiences. Dr. Stuart Robinson's latest book is called Prayer Power, Changing the World and You. One reviewer says this book holds the keys necessary to prepare us for revival. Just a little about our special guest. Dr. Stuart Robinson is the founding pastor of Australia's largest Baptist church. Lots of listeners will be familiar with Crossway Baptist Church. He was leading it for 25 years. He was a pioneering missionary and church planter in South Asia, and he's been an in-demand conference speaker as an authority on church growth, cross-cultural mission and Islam. Stuart Robinson, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Glad to be with you today.
Stuart, I perhaps would be neglecting the important things if we didn't start on the terror attack overnight at a church in Western Sydney. Not sure how across you are the details. Those things are still breaking. But did you have a thought? There was a stabbing attack at Christ the Good Shepherd Church, an Assyrian Orthodox church. Did you have an immediate response?
No, not really, because I'm not surprised at that sort of event. You see, the common characteristic or description which Muslims claim of Islam is that it is a religion of peace. In their saying that, they are accurate, but they don't explain what they mean by peace. You need to dig into the texts of Islam to understand these things a little bit more. And there you find quite a lot of violence and so forth. By peace, if I can start with that, Muslims divide the world into two. There is the Darul Islam, that is the House of Islam, and there is Darul Harb, that is the House of War. And where these two come together, that is the place of jihad and conflict. And peace will be obtained, according to Muslim teaching, when the Prophet Jesus, not the New Testament prophet, but the Islamic prophet Jesus, who's quite different, when he returns as judge, or when Islam conquers the world in total. So until that time, there must be jihad. And we see that sort of violence occurring around the world. In fact, there is a site to which people can go. It's called The Religion of Peace, and they have kept a record of all of the attacks by Islamists since 9/11 back in 2001. And just before this program started, I went and had a look, and the number of those attacks now add up to 45,097. So it is against that background that I'm not surprised that from time to time we have them here in Australia. We're very fortunate because in our nation, Islam is only about 1% or so of the population. Therefore, in that situation, Muslims tend to be quiet and observing the laws of the nation. But if I go to other countries, particularly where the Assyrians come from in their own country, in the Middle East, in Iraq and so forth. They've almost been completely obliterated there under the pressure of Islam over the centuries. So now we have an attack again in Australia. But as I say, I'm not surprised at that.
Now, what we've got here is the alleged attacker is just a 15-year-old boy. And we might perhaps read between the lines and say the thing that would have radicalised him to make an attack on a priest in a church could be along the lines of what you're saying. There's this thing, jihad. Sometimes we think that as something that's ancient or it happens in other countries. We don't think of that happening here. What are your thoughts on the fact that there would be those who would be so emotional about defending their prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, out of jihad? Thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. Firstly, the young man about whom I know what we say here, said, I'm not surprised at someone so young making an attack like that, because when you again inquire into the educational literature which is in Muslim jurisdictions, and I don't know what that situation is here in Australia, but if you look at, say, Hamas or Iraq or these sort of countries, the children are educated and trained in this way from a very early age. They grow up with that and they don't have any other alternate interpretation. So it comes into their lives very, very early. There's a very well-known psychiatrist, a Muslim psychiatrist in Sydney, very highly respected gentleman. His name is Tanvir Ahmed. And back in 2014, he said, Islam is primarily a religion of conquest. The fact that the vast majority of Muslims are peace-loving and committed to Australia is not because of Islam, but despite it. They have too much to lose to interpret Islam literally. So what did he mean by that? Well, of course, there are sundry Islamist movements on the rise around the world who do interpret it literally. But here in Australia, the Muslims who've come from various countries, they've come to a good place, and they don't want to risk that at this time in their lives. Another fellow by the name of Abdul Rahman al-Rashid, he's the general manager of Al Arabiya, that's a printing organization, Muslim press. And he said, it is a certain fact that not all Muslims are terrorists, but it is equally certain and exceptionally painful that almost all terrorists are Muslims. Now, that's their words, not mine. But so these are Muslims within Islam who are recognizing the pain that this causes to the whole of their society. But because the words of violence are both taught and they're there in the sacred texts of Islam, it's up to anyone to take them up and implement them at any time they like with claiming that authority.
Let me ask you about a dimension no one else is talking about. The church that came under attack last night is an Assyrian Orthodox church. Test your history here, because the Assyrian Christians is one of the oldest expressions of Christianity. Really, you might even say out of Pentecost. The people who moved into those areas, in mission, they moved into the Assyrian territories, which these days are Iraq, Iran, those northern aspects of those countries. It is an Assyrian Orthodox church that's under attack. Any thoughts here about Assyrian Orthodox and the fact that it might not look like the ordinary Baptist church or Pentecostal church that people go to, but this is actually one of those great ancient expressions of Christianity?
Yes, you are testing my knowledge of history without searching it. I know that the Assyrians, who speak Aramaic, actually, which is, of course, the language Jesus spoke. He didn't speak English. he certainly didn't speak Koine Greek or Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic. And so the Assyrian Orthodox people, they are the last of the Aramaic-speaking people in the world. And of course, as I said before, over the centuries, as is the case in every Middle Eastern country where Christianity has been under extensive pressure to convert everyone to Islam, those Assyrians have spread around the world, and some of them have come here. We need to honor them because over the years of incredible pressure upon them, they have sustained the faith. We might not agree with some of the ceremonies that they have accumulated over many centuries because we haven't been in operating that long ourselves. But we need to honor them, that they have remained faithful under extreme pressure. They're an amazing people.
Now, there's some detail about the attack overnight, which some will find disturbing, and I'll be interested in your thoughts here. So I'm throwing you into the deep end because the streets around the church overnight descended into mayhem when obviously hundreds who were watching the live stream of the priest who was attacked and allegedly stabbed, they'd turned out, and the police had to turn out in force too. Something like 150 officers turned out because the emotions were so high that the people who were attached to the church were not going to be taking this lightly. They wanted revenge on the spot. Christians and our response when these things happen. What are your perspectives here?
You know, this is an area in which we need to carefully think our response before we come into a crisis situation or before we confront threat or danger ourselves. Because unless we do that, what will happen is, in the face of crisis, the fight or flight mode kicks in instinctively. Most people, of course, at the confrontation of or the approach of threat, run away. Even though we Christians say we trust the Lord, we've handed over our lives to Him, He is our protector, etc. But those sayings that we have, which are justified by Scripture, we tend to forget about them when real danger approaches. And so what has happened here probably is, without thinking of what the Bible says, these people have gone into a fight or attack mode. Of course, I can't commend that. That's not the example of our Lord, but nor will I stand in judgment on them. I understand the extreme grief and anger that they are living with. And of course, they've come out of a situation of abuse over the centuries. They have these historic memories of which we have none.
Okay, and I guess it would be important for us to recognise the response of Bishop Mari Emmanuel, who was on the receiving end of this knife attack, prayed for his attacker before being taken away. Well, our special guest is Dr. Stuart Robinson. His latest book is called Prayer Power, Changing the World and You. And I haven't read it cover to cover yet. I've taken about the first 4 chapters, and I've got to say it's outstanding. It has my recommendation. You ought to get a hold of it because this is a book that is filled with wisdom around prayer. And Stuart, we'll talk about that soon because I want to ask you about a new book that you've already got on the boil now, and you've spent years just collating 20 years of study around Islam and the developments around the world. Tell me about your new project beyond the book that we should be talking about.
Okay. Well, actually, it's for the last 24 years I've been collecting materials and research. I do that all the time, of course. And I've spent 4 years writing it up. I've just finished the draft. It's about 200,000 words. It's a big book. And this one, which will come out sometime in the next year, will be called Future History: The Rise and Demise of Islam or Christianity. That's a provocative title. You see, one of the things that got me thinking about this is, as you examine the church in the West, in every country. We are in serious decline, walking toward oblivion as sleepwalkers, actually. At the same time, Islam is on the rise. It's in a revivalist mode. In 1900, at the turn of that century, Islam was 11% of the world. By the turn of the century in which we are now, it's 22%. And already it's up now to about 25, 27%. It is estimated by demographers that at the current rate of increase and the demise of Christianity, which has gone from 34 to 32% of the world over that century, that by the 2070s, numerically, Islam will be the number one religion of the world. That has serious implications. And what are we going to do about it? So the first thing is to acknowledge what's happening, to give people understanding. The second is to explain how it's happening. And the third is to craft a response. So that's what this book is about, or will be about.
Certainly an encouragement to get serious about your own Christian faith and understand now and do all of those things that we've been encouraged in the Bible, to talk to our children and to our grandchildren and pass on to them the wisdom of the faith that we have in Christ. Hey, I'm going to let listeners in on our conversation today. 1-800-316-316. Let's take some calls. Philip is in Albany in Western Australia. Hey, Philip, welcome.
Good morning. My main concern, especially with this 15-year-old, was he radicalised by an imam? We have had reports in the media of genuine hate speech, which the federal authorities don't seem to be doing anything about. And the Grand Mufti of Australia, to be commended, denouncing the attack. But what is he and what is the government doing to stop the hate preaching?
A new example right now, and undoubtedly there are some high-level meetings. I did mention earlier there was a meeting of those who are a part of the Islamic communities, the Australian National Imams Council. They have already met and they've issued a statement unequivocally condemning the attack on Bishop Mari Emmanuel. But Stuart, thoughts here for Philip?
Yeah. Look, in general, we have a little problem that Muslim leaders in minority situations in the West, they make appropriate statements to speak into whatever is happening in their countries. So they will often say one thing in English, but when they're speaking to their own congregations in Arabic, then it's another thing. This is called the doctrine of taqiyya, in which one is permitted by the sacred text of Islam, if the faith, if the religion or the person is under threat, it's permissible to lie or to dissemble or whatever. Now, so I expect in situations like this, you'll always have Muslim leaders coming out and saying the right and the appropriate thing. And that's great. That calms down society. But it doesn't change what's happened, what's written, and of course, how they might speak when they're not making public statements. So I'd rather not comment too much on what the Islamic Council is coming out with, other than to say, I certainly expected that they would say something like this.
Philip, thank you so much for your call, touching on a very important point. Appreciate you calling through. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today. Let's take another call. Bart is in Perth, WA. Hey, Bart, welcome.
Hi, how are you this morning?
Very well, Bart. What are your thoughts?
I just had a query, obviously, because of the attacks that have happened in Sydney over the last couple of days. Obviously, when people are getting attacked and things like that, I suppose my query is, as a Christian, we know we're heaven-bound anyway if you belong to the Lord, but it says anarchy will abound in the last days, and many of these things will rise up. But as a Christian, I mean, I suppose my query is if we go in to protect somebody or, disarm that person that's causing danger or something like that, that'd be still an honourable thing in laying down your life for your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, I suppose. So what I'm saying, if we had to do that and you were willing to do that, I know you said fight or flight, somebody could run away from the sin, but some may run in there to try and help. So I suppose my query is, if you go to do that sort of thing, I know it is a form of violence, but it's also a protection.
Yes, defence and attack, they both mean taking, in some sense, a physical approach to some of these things. Stuart, a thought or two for Bart?
Yeah. Look, in this incident which has occurred, could I say to people, don't blame the people, that is the Muslims. The problem is not with the Muslims. The problem is with Islam, the religion, which of course depends upon their sacred scriptures. That is the Quran, and then the Hadith, that's the traditions of the Prophet. And everything is in there. Now, if you are in a community where you are being taught from those books and you have no right to question any inconsistencies, because in the Quran and in the Hadith, there are sections there which say you just accept what the leaders, the imams say without question, and you have no access to any alternate points of view, then of course you are going to be affected by that. And that's the only source of teaching and information in people's lives. This is one of the outcomes. Fortunately, it's not the same outcome for everybody, but it's one of the commoner or increasingly common outcomes. So keep in mind that Muslims, just like everybody else, including ourselves, they are in desperate need of the mercy of God. It is not their fault that they have been kept in darkness from the truth that we say is the truth in Jesus Christ. That is our fault, that we haven't been more forthcoming in telling them of the love of God rather than the hatred which Allah portrays in the Quran.
Well, Bart, thank you so much for another important observation and question there. Let's squeeze in another call before news. Donna is in Hamilton in Victoria. Hey, Donna, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, Donna. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was listening to the news last night about the stabbing, and I've only seen it once, but there was a young teenage girl that was interviewed, and she'd been pepper sprayed by accident by the police, but she didn't get upset with the police. And she said she was praying for the boy that stabbed her beloved bishop. She forgave him, and she said that she was sure that the bishop would do the same. And I wish they would show that interview more, but I've only seen it one time.
Yes, the portrayal in the media actually helps shape people's understanding of what happened, and we've been giving some attention to the fact that the bishop, before he was taken away in the ambulance, stopped and prayed even for his attacker, a prayer of forgiveness. Stuart, your thoughts here for Donna?
Well, I haven't seen any of those clips, so I'm going on hearsay here. But I was very glad to hear that. You might recall that when Pope John Paul the 23rd, or whatever his official title was, when he was shot by a Turkish fellow, didn't kill the Pope, but the Pope forgave him and then went and visited him in prison over the years until the fellow was released from prison. So that is a superb example of how we are to respond in the case of the provocation of such evil. And I hope that the Australian constituency, the people here, will not allow this violence to poison their minds. We have to maintain a position of forgiveness and mercy and graciousness toward these people who happen to be Muslims, but they could be any people who are attacking us.
We're about to break for news. I want to thank Donna from Hamilton in Victoria. Our talkback line's open on 1800 316 316. Our special guest is Dr. Stuart Robinson, founding pastor of Australia's largest Baptist church, the Crossway Baptist Church. He was at the helm for 25 years, was a pioneering missionary and church planter in South Asia. He's been an in-demand conference speaker and an authority on church growth, cross-cultural mission and Islam. He has a new book that's out called Prayer Power, Changing the World and You, and it's one of those things, mark your diary. He's also been... Stuart, we just talk about some of the developments that have been happening in the Middle East. We've all been following along with lots of interest. The Israel-Hamas war, and we're aware that those forces from the north and from the south, and now coming from Iran itself, impacting on Israel. I wonder, Stuart, if you've got your own overall impressions as to how things are developing in the Middle East right now.
Okay, well, at two levels. There's the obvious political, religious level, and then there's the spiritual level and end of times, which whenever we think of Israel, we, of course, think of the end of time. In Islam's text, that's Quran, Hadith, it's authoritative text. Repeatedly, it's mentioned there through the revelations given to Prophet Muhammad. It is said from Allah that the Jews, they must be destroyed, and they are to be treated very harshly. They will be in hell, all sorts of negative things like that. And for that reason, there can never be peace between Muslims and Jews. In fact, in Hamas's constitution, of course, they have it there that their goal is the total annihilation of Israel. And their Muslim leaders are often quoted making speeches like that. So every Muslim knows that, and they cannot accept the state of Israel as a political entity, because when in the 7th century Islam overran the Byzantine Empire and captured that which is today called Palestine, Muslims believe once a territory is captured, it is theirs forever. And so here's a case where the Wafd, that's the body responsible for the trusteeship of Muslim lands, here they have lost that possession. That can never be agreed to, and so they will fight endlessly against that. That's why it's in some of the constitutions. The Palestinian Authority, you might recall the Oslo Accords, everyone was so happy about that. But Yasser Arafat, having signed those and been a part of it, then he went down to South Africa and, speaking to his own people, gave a totally different speech about, don't worry about those accords, you must join us in jihad to take that territory. Now, he could say that. He could sign an accord, just as the Iran almost signed a nuclear accord for a maximum of 10 years, because the Prophet once signed an accord, it's called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, with the Meccans, and it was 10 years there would be peace. But after 2 years, when he got sufficient power, he broke the treaty and attacked the Meccans and won that particular war. So Muslims cannot have a treaty which is longer than 10 years or until they have the power to overcome the enemy. So there's some of from the Islamic point of view of the existence of Israel, they cannot accept that it should ever be there. So now, if we come back from that and consider the spiritual implications from a Christian point of view, we know from the book of Ezekiel that the land will come under attack from Gog and Magog. In the book of Ezekiel, it talks about that. For the first time in history, Gog and Magog, by the way, you can't be too definite about the current physical equivalence, but it's generally accepted that Iran, Turkey, Russia, these are the countries who are the principals involved, and there are others as well. So for the first time in history, there is now an alliance between Russia and Turkey and Iran. That's never happened before. And you can see this gradually unfolding, and they're turning in toward Israel as we know it. So we need to keep the big picture in mind. We're heading toward the end of days. And we know, of course, there will be battles and all of these sorts of things.
We've been talking about Iran on this program for some time as the ones who have been puppeteering these other proxy states around issues to do with Israel. Iran's also renowned to be one of the fastest growing Christian churches in the world. And just recently there were reports that we were talking about on this program, Stuart. I'm not sure whether you were across those, but out of the 75,000 mosques in Iran, reports are that 50,000 of those have closed because of a downturn in Islamic faith in Iran. Are you across those reports? Is that something that is credible?
It's certainly credible. I need to be careful what I say here. Shall we say I have access into what is happening in Iran? And yes, a lot of the reports coming in say that the mosques are empty. I mean, in Qom, which is the capital, the religious center for Iran, that's where the Ayatollah Khomeini and all those big fellas had their mosques. There are thousands of madrasas there. But those mosques also are empty. When Ayatollah Khomeini came promising the Islamic Revolution, promising heaven on earth, and for some, of course, it ended up as hell on earth, as they became disenchanted with what he had produced. At that time in Iran in 1979, there was calculated to be about 500 Muslim background believers. However, as the persecution set in, I think, and I haven't got my figures before me, so I'm open to question here, but about 2008, that had grown to 250,000. Then by 2016, the figure was about 1 million evangelical Christians in Iran, of whom the majority were Muslim background believers. So it's a classic case that the more persecution goes on, then the more the church is going to grow, similar to what's happened in China. And yes, Iran is one of those places where the Christian church underground, against tremendous persecution, has been growing exponentially.
And it's one reason why I do want to get to some insight into your brand new book called Prayer Power, Changing the World and You. And we might get to that, but I'm wanting to bring listeners into the conversation too. We've got a terror attack on our soil overnight. We've got those developments that are going on in the Middle East. Let's take some more calls, listeners. Jenny is in Portland in Victoria. Hey, Jenny, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Thoughts here from you, Jenny?
Okay, I missed the first part of your conversation, but I've seen the news reports and everything. Basically, what I want to say is I'm utterly disgusted at the way the police and the ambulance people and paramedics were treated. And, it's all right to quote that this bishop prayed for the attacker, and I'm a Catholic, and Pope John Paul prayed for his attacker. We didn't send a mob of violence to do anything about it. That's just not Christian in my books. And why didn't the bishop call them off somewhere? Look, I'm just so disgusted. I will believe these people are Christian when that mob goes to the police station and apologises for the damage they've done to the cars and the police who were injured. It's just not on.
I think there's so many going to be with you on that, Jenny. Yes, we bring into our own judgment how the Christians responded on the streets in Sydney overnight. Let's bring this to our special guest. What are your thoughts here, Stuart, for Jenny?
It's a very natural response. And of course, what I said earlier, and Jenny might not have been listening at that time, that we need to decide in advance what is a biblical position when we personally face a crisis of this magnitude. Unless we carefully think our way through it prior to this event happening, then when it rolls upon us, we react emotionally rather than biblically as we should react. And I'm certainly not commending, and I haven't read the reports of what is alleged to have happened there, but I wouldn't be commending the crowd response. That's just a case of stampeded emotions unleashed.
And would it be fair to say, Stuart, with Jenny, that Christians are not immune from having an emotional and even violent response when we feel like we are being threatened? Is that something we ought to be considerate of?
Yeah, certainly we're not immune. I don't commend it. That's why I say that you need to carefully work through your thoughts in advance of the violence as to what is a biblical response. And a biblical response mostly is countercultural to the natural emotional responses that we make.
Jenny in Portland, thank you so much for your call. 1800 316 316. An important conversation, as you can hear today. Let's take another call. Richard is in Swansea in Tasmania. Hey, Richard, welcome along.
G'day. Thanks, Neil, and thank you, Stuart. I picked up on what you were saying about we can't really blame Islam when the people there are indoctrinated or told, and that's the only thing that they know. You said that we're at fault because we haven't shared the message, we haven't shared the gospel. I think that's a really good point.
This is an important point, isn't it? And how mission sometimes works in dynamic, Stuart. Because sometimes we used to think of cross-cultural mission. You'd go overseas to be a missionary. Well, overseas is coming to Australia. How much onus is there on us to be missionaries to those who are on our shores? What are your thoughts here for Richard?
Well, yeah, I think Richard and I are in agreement here. Firstly, there's the overseas situation where there are still something like 7,400 unreached people groups. That means that in these particular linguistic cultural groups, there's no Bible, there's no witness, there's no church, and we're basically ignoring them. And it shows we set our priorities. You see it clearest in where we spend our money. 90% of our money, of course, is spent on ourselves in our churches in Australia. And when it comes to mission money spent on missions, only about 1% or some minuscule amount ever gets spent on mission to Muslims. There are, I think, 300 unreached people groups, each of more than 1 million people, that are totally Islamic. Think about that. And in 1,400 years, nobody has reached out to these people. We are the ones, in a sense, that are indictable in these matters. We're the ones that need to apologize to God and resolve to reorient those priorities.
Richard, anything further to add?
Oh, yeah, indeed. Last time I heard Stuart talking, it was about the book Prayer Power. I actually reached out and bought it. It is a fantastic book, very easy to read because there's so much encouraging, exciting stories of how God has worked in answered prayer. It makes you just say, hey, I want to get involved in this. In your book, you mention the reason why we don't pray is we are lazy. Well, that prompted me into action, I'm afraid.
All right. Let's just start. We'll move into a conversation about the book in the remaining minutes that we've got here, Stuart. Let's just be honest here. Is this the reason why lots of Aussies do not pray? Are we simply lazy?
Firstly, I didn't say that. It's in the book, yes.
Okay.
It was a quote of a lecturer made at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was talking to his class about it, and he said the reason we don't pray is because we're lazy. I guess if we're meant to get out of bed a great while before it's yet dark, as the psalmist said we should, or when Jesus obviously did, we tend not to do that. And so in that sense, we also can be lazy.
I want to thank Richard for calling in, making a very good point. And we might put a line under our calls for now, because I do want to talk about this new book of yours. The new book is called Prayer Power. changing the world and you. Stuart, if we're talking about the need for another book on prayer, this is something that you have obviously been teaching for decade upon decade upon decade. Here's a book that contains the wisdom not only of someone who's a cross-cultural missionary, but someone who understands our Australian context. How do you describe the value of what people will be looking at when they read your book, Prayer Power?
Well, firstly, I think they need to understand why I bothered to contribute yet another book on prayer, because there's so much written on it. And the reason I did that is because from my own research around the world and my travels, I understand the church in the West is dying. And we've seen that in the census results here in Australia. It's paradoxical that in the West we have the best educated clergy, the most advanced technology to share our message, the most state-of-the-art facilities, and yet the church is sleepwalking toward oblivion. And when I travel around the world, I find that where the church is growing exponentially, and there are places like this, there are always the same factors I find there. And one of them is persistent, persevering, prevailing prayer, such as we never have across here in Australia. I'm not totally thinking negatively about the church in the West, because an English wit once remarked that the death of the church had often been predicted because it had gone to the dogs. But in every case, it was the dogs that died and the church revived. And so I'm still hoping that the church might be revived. But this book is a modest attempt to contribute toward that outcome of the church reviving.
The title of the book is Prayer Power. Now, there seems to be a disconnect with a lot of Christians who think if I take that time and I go into my quiet place, into my prayer closet, that somehow or other I'll be wasting my time speaking into the air. Will God hear me? Will my prayer be powerful? Thoughts here on the title. It's called Prayer Power.
Well, yes, we go through our dry times, and we do at times think that our prayers are powerless, but they're seasons of life. I base my thoughts and my comments not on what I feel about prayer, but on what God has said about it, and especially what Jesus exemplified and taught about it. And so, my faith is not dependent on the answer that God gives to our prayers. It is our response to him when he seems not to give any answer. And so I spell faith, R-I-S-K. I define it as living in the midst of miracles, always on the edge of disaster. And with this faith, then we dare to be involved in things which are so big they're doomed to failure unless God is in it. Keep in mind, God doesn't expect the impossible from us. He wants us to expect the impossible from him.
When we might assume that with a terror attack so fresh as one that happened overnight on our shores, and this time attack on a Christian church, stabbing of a bishop, on the edge of crisis, is this something that might spur us to a new, fresh look at prayer right now?
Well, from my own personal example, I've often been in hostile situations or in times of extreme need. And had not God supernaturally intervened, I wouldn't be alive today to testify to his real power, his provision, his answer to prayer. And yes, I pray that people will commence to pray and allow God into the situation in amazing, miraculous ways. Remember this, that the earliest terrorist of the Christian church was a fellow called Saul, and he met with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he became the most outstanding apostle called Paul. And still today we find that the most zealous terrorists make the best Christian evangelists when they meet Jesus. So they come from Islam into Christianity, and amazing transformations. You'll find some of those in the book as you read it, I hope.
And look for those testimonies in your own community. Hey, time is now limited. What are 2 key takeaways from the book for listeners right now who are challenged with what's going on globally, with what's going on locally on our own shores. The idea of prayer power, a couple of takeaways from the book.
Okay, I've already mentioned them. One is faith is not dependent upon answers that God gives to our prayers. It's our response to him when he seems not to give an answer. That's a takeaway. Number 2, God doesn't expect the impossible from us. He wants us to expect the impossible from him. And wherever people have taken up what I've been writing and saying in prayer, I have seen churches totally revived and go on to growth rather than closing their doors, which is happening to 5% of Australian churches every year.
Wonderful insights today, Stuart Robinson. And for every listener right now, if you've never bought a book on prayer, my encouragement is this is the best book to get right now, and you'll be able to find it online booksellers, or you can go to drstuartrobinson.com. No doubt you can get a link there on Stuart's website. But Stuart Robinson's latest book is called Prayer Power, Changing the World and You. We also mentioned that he's written a whole lot of other books. One of those, which is a tremendous bestseller, Mosques and Miracles, sold more than 100,000 copies around the world. He's written some other books on Islam, The Challenge of Islam, The Hidden Half, Women and Islam, and Islam Rising. We've also heard that Stuart has spent the last 4 years systematising the last 20 years of collected research materials for his next book. So you can't get a hold of this one right now, but no doubt when it does get released, we'll be doing a segment on it and talking to Stuart about future history, the rise and demise of Islam or Christianity. Stuart Robinson, just wonderful getting your insights today, and I want to thank you so much from every listener because sharing these things, just timely and powerful. Thank you so much for joining us on 2020.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.